I knew moving to this neighborhood was a mistake the moment I saw her. Arms crossed, lips pursed, standing on her porch like she was the queen of the HOA, watching us unload our moving truck, as if we were criminals trespassing on sacred land. But I didn't care. All that mattered was that my son, Lucas, finally had a safe place to play outside, something he had been dreaming about since the accident. Little did I know, the woman across the street, whom I would later learn was named Karen Whitmore, had already declared war on us before we had even unpacked a single box. The first encounter was just the beginning. It started with a scowl when she saw Lucas rolling his wheelchair onto the sidewalk, a barely audible but unmistakable TSK of disapproval. I ignored it. People like her existed everywhere, self-important, miserable, and convinced that their tiny patch of suburbia was an empire they ruled with an iron fist. But when she actually walked over, clipboard in hand, I knew I wasn't getting off that easy. "Excuse me," she said in that tone people use when they're about to pretend they're being polite. "We have HOA rules about children playing outside during certain hours." I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your son. He's making the neighborhood look unkempt." I swear my brain short-circuited. I thought maybe I had misheard her. But nope, she doubled down. "This is a quiet community. We like things to look a certain way. The HOA guidelines clearly state that recreational activity should be done in designated areas." I looked around, scanning for hidden cameras. Maybe this was some bizarre social experiment, testing how long a person could endure sheer stupidity before snapping. "My son is sitting in his wheelchair and tossing a ball. That's it." She sighed dramatically, glancing around as if waiting for other neighbors to come to her defense. "I don't make the rules," she said, though she absolutely did. "I enforce them. And if we let one person disregard community standards, where does it end?" "Oh, I don't know," I said, arms folded. "Maybe with people minding their own business and letting a child have some damn fun?" She gasped like I had slapped her with a wet fish. "This attitude won't get you very far in this neighborhood," she warned. "And I would hate for your first month here to be difficult." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I shook my head and walked away, expecting that to be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, the first letter arrived. A fine. A freaking fine for unauthorized recreational activity outside designated areas. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. But when I showed it to Lucas, his face fell. "Are we in trouble?" he asked. "No, buddy," I said. "We're just dealing with someone who has way too much time on their hands." I tossed the letter in the trash, determined to ignore it. But Karen? Oh, she wasn't the type to be ignored. The next time Lucas went outside, she marched up, phone in hand, recording us like we were zoo animals. "You are in direct violation of HOA policies," she announced, like a mall cop on a power trip. "I will be reporting this." "Lady, report it to NASA for all I care," I snapped. "My kid isn't doing anything wrong." And that's when she did something I still can't believe. She reached out and grabbed Lucas's ball. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Give that back," I said, my voice dangerously low. She smiled, gripping it tighter. "I am the HOA president," she said. "And I say this play is over." I took a step forward, ready to snatch it from her, when Lucas spoke up, his voice trembling but steady. "You're a mean lady," she scoffed, looking at him like he was a stray dog barking at her. "Children should respect their elders," she sneered. I clenched my fists, taking deep breaths to keep from exploding. "Lady, if you don't give that back right now." She dropped it, not on the ground, into the storm drain. Lucas gasped. I saw red. "You psycho!" I shouted. She shrugged. "Now he won't be violating HOA rules." I wanted to scream, wanted to do something, but before I could react, Karen flung herself backward onto the pavement. Lucas and I froze. She let out an ear-piercing shriek, writhing on the ground like she had been hit by a sniper. "Oh God! He attacked me! Your kid attacked me!" I stared at her, my brain struggling to comprehend the sheer level of lunacy unfolding before me. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered. Neighbors started peeking out their windows. And then, Karen pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "This is Karen Whitmore, HOA president. I have just been brutally assaulted by an out-of-control child." Lucas's eyes went wide with fear. "Mom, am I in trouble?" "No, baby," I whispered. "She is." The cops arrived within minutes. I could already see Karen gearing up for an Oscar-worthy performance. She clutched her injured knee, moaning dramatically as an officer approached. He ran me over," she sobbed, pointing at Lucas. The officer turned to look at my son, who sat frozen in his wheelchair, looking like he was about to cry. "She's lying," I said before the officer could open his mouth. "There are security cameras." Karen's face turned the color of spoiled milk. "What?" she squeaked. I gestured toward the porch of the house across the street, where my neighbor, old Mr. Dawson, sat with a beer in one hand and a remote control in the other. "Got the whole thing recorded," he said with a smirk. Karen went completely still. The officer sighed and walked over to Mr. Dawson's house to check the footage. Karen shot me a glare so venomous it could have melted steel. "You have no idea who you're messing with," she hissed. "Neither do you," I shot back. Minutes later, the officer came back, shaking his head. "Ma'am, we have the footage," he said. "You were not assaulted." Karen sat up, feigning innocence. I must have fallen. The shock. The officer ignored her. "If you file a false police report again, you will be arrested." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. The officer turned to me and Lucas. "Sorry for the trouble, ma'am." I nodded. "It's fine. But I'd appreciate it if you let the HOA know that my son has every right to be outside." Karen didn't even let the officer finish before she scrambled to her feet and stormed away, red-faced and seething. As soon as she was gone, Lucas looked up at me. "Does this mean I can keep playing outside?" I smiled. "Oh, baby, it means we're just getting started." The next morning, I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, expecting some peace after yesterday's disaster. Instead, I found an envelope taped to my front door. My stomach sank before I even opened it. Sure enough, it was another letter from the HOA, stamped with an official-looking seal and signed by none other than Karen Whitmore herself. The list of violations inside was so ridiculous I had to read it twice just to believe it. Grass 1 inch too high. Trash cans placed 5 inches too far from the curb. A disturbing noise complaint, which I could only assume referred to Lucas's laughter from the previous evening. And the most absurd one of all, an official warning for reckless wheelchair usage. I had to sit down. Karen had officially lost what little mind she had left. I knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about rules. It was about revenge. She had embarrassed herself with that fake fall, and now she was trying to make my life miserable to prove she still had power. But if she thought I was going to roll over and take it, she was in for a surprise. That same afternoon, I walked right up to her house and rang the doorbell. Karen opened the door with a smirk, holding a glass of iced tea like she was the first lady of the neighborhood. I was wondering when you'd come by," she said sweetly. "Did you get my notice?" "Oh, I got it," I said, waving the letter. "And let me guess, if I don't pay these made-up fines, I get more fines, right?" "That's how the system works," she said, shrugging. "You agreed to the HOA rules when you moved in." I laughed. "Right, because I'm sure there's a section about banning children from playing outside and issuing citations for imaginary infractions." She smiled, but there was something venomous underneath it. "You really should be careful about making enemies, dear." I stepped closer. "And you should be careful about abusing your power." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear. But it disappeared just as quickly. "Enjoy your day," she said, closing the door in my face. I walked away knowing that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next week turned into a full-on war. Karen sent out more notices, each one more ridiculous than the last. She started fining my next-door neighbor, An elderly man named Mr. Dawson, for excessive decorations because he had a single wind chime. She harassed the Johnsons down the street for leaving their porch light on too late. She even tried to enforce a rule about mailbox colors, one that conveniently only applied to people she didn't like. But the moment she really crossed the line was when she went after Lucas again. I came home one afternoon to find my son sitting on the porch, looking down at something in his lap. His wheelchair was gone. "Lucas?" I rushed over, panic rising. "Where's your chair?" He didn't look up. Instead, he just pointed at the driveway. That's when I saw it, his wheelchair, tipped over and locked with a bright yellow parking boot. For a second, I couldn't move, couldn't think. Then rage filled my entire body like wildfire. "Karen." I marched straight to her house and banged on the door. She answered, and before she could even smirk, I shoved the HOA letter she had taped to my own front door right into her face. "You put a boot on my son's wheelchair?" My voice shook, not from fear, but from sheer fury. Her smile was smug, like she had been waiting for this moment. "Unauthorized vehicle parked in a restricted area. He's a child. In a wheelchair. You absolute monster." She gave a dramatic sigh. "Rules are rules." I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. "You have exactly 5 minutes to remove it before I call every news station in the city and tell them the HOA president is targeting a disabled child." For the first time, she hesitated. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but I wasn't finished. "I'll file a harassment lawsuit so fast your ugly little clipboard will burst into flames. And I guarantee, if this gets out, the HOA board will throw you under the bus so hard you'll be picking asphalt out of your teeth for a year." Her face twitched. 2 minutes later, the boot was gone. Karen wasn't happy. That much was obvious. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. The next day, I saw her outside talking to a group of HOA members, pointing at my house and whispering like a cartoon villain. By nightfall, my mailbox had been painted a different color, one that clashed horrifically with my house. The morning after that, I received an official notice for a mandatory HOA meeting. The only item on the agenda? Discussing the removal of disruptive homeowners. Oh, she was trying to evict me. But if she thought she had the upper hand, she was in for another surprise. I had spent the last week collecting evidence. Every ridiculous fine, every threatening letter, every recording of her harassing me and other neighbors. And I wasn't the only one. Mr. Dawson had been secretly documenting her antics for months. The Johnsons had recorded her screaming at their teenage son for walking too loudly. Even sweet Mrs. Patel, who had been here for years, had proof of Karen demanding bribes for overlooking violations. By the time the meeting rolled around, I was more than ready. Karen sat at the head of the table, acting like a judge about to sentence me to exile. The HOA board members sat beside her, most of them looking uncomfortable. The neighborhood residents filled the room, whispering among themselves. She cleared her throat and put on her best fake concerned face. "We are here today to discuss serious concerns regarding certain individuals who are disrupting the peace and standards of our community." I leaned back in my chair. "Oh, you mean you?" Her expression flickered, but she forced a smile. "You have repeatedly ignored HOA regulations." "Ignored?" I laughed, pulling out the stack of letters she had sent. "Or do you mean I refuse to bow down to your personal dictatorship?" Murmurs filled the room. Mr. Dawson stood up and pulled out his phone. "I have recordings of you threatening residents, Karen." The Johnsons nodded. "And we have proof of you illegally pocketing fine money." Karen's face turned pale. I stood, placing my hands on the table. "Let's get one thing straight. You don't own this neighborhood. And if you don't step down, I will personally ensure that every one of your corrupt actions is reported to the authorities." Dead silence filled the room. The board members exchanged glances. And then, for the first time ever, Karen looked nervous. It was far from over. But for the first time, I knew without a doubt, her downfall had begun. Karen didn't go down quietly. That just wasn't in her nature. The moment the meeting ended, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard the entire room went silent. But I knew this wasn't over. She wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. No, she was going to fight back, and if I had learned anything about her by now, it was that she was at her most dangerous when she felt cornered. I expected petty retaliation. Maybe another bogus fine, maybe some passive-aggressive emails. What I didn't expect was to wake up the next morning to find my lawn completely trashed. Someone had dumped garbage all over it: eggs, toilet paper, old food, even a pile of what I was fairly certain was cat litter. I didn't have to think hard about who was responsible. Karen had officially gone from HOA tyrant to middle school bully. Lucas rolled onto the porch and took one look at the mess. "Wow," he said. "She's really bad at this." I laughed, even though I was seething inside. "Yeah, buddy, she really is." I spent the next hour cleaning up, knowing full well she was watching from her window, probably waiting for me to snap. But I wasn't giving her the satisfaction. If she wanted to play dirty, I had something even better. That afternoon, I sent a complaint to the HOA board, but not just any complaint. I attached every single piece of evidence I had collected over the past few weeks: videos, emails, testimonies from neighbors. I sent copies to the local news station, the mayor's office, and even a few lawyers who specialized in HOA fraud cases. Karen had made a career out of making people's lives miserable. Now it was her turn. By evening, the neighborhood was buzzing. People were talking, whispering in hushed tones, glancing toward her house. It was clear the tides had shifted. The fear she had instilled in everyone was crumbling. More neighbors were coming forward, sharing their own horror stories, their own ridiculous fines, their own frustrations. Then came the ultimate blow. A knock at my door startled me just as I was settling in for the night. When I opened it, I found a man in a suit standing there, holding a folder thick with paperwork. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm with the State Homeowners Association Regulatory Board. We've received multiple complaints about an HOA official engaging in fraud, misuse of funds, and harassment. Would you be willing to make a formal statement?" I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely. The next morning, Karen's house was swarmed. Officials, lawyers, even a few reporters. She tried to put on her usual act, all fake smiles and innocence, but the moment someone mentioned financial audit, her mask slipped. She started shouting about slander, about false accusations, about how this was all a conspiracy against her. The moment that really sealed her fate, though, was when they asked to see the HOA's financial records. The ones she had sole access to. The ones she had refused to share with anyone for years. She stalled, she made excuses, she claimed she couldn't find them. That's when the police showed up. I had never seen someone switch emotions so fast. One moment she was arrogant, dismissive, full of herself. The next, she was panicked, frantic, sweating through her pastel blazer. She tried to argue, to threaten, to throw out every excuse in the book. But the second an officer pulled out handcuffs, the fight drained out of her. "You can't do this," she screeched as they led her toward the car. "I am the HOA." That was when Mr. Dawson, standing with the rest of the neighborhood, let out a slow, mocking clap. One by one, the neighbors joined in, until the entire street was applauding, watching as Karen was shoved into the back of the police cruiser. Lucas, sitting beside me on the porch, grinned. "Does this mean we win?" I ruffled his hair. "Oh, baby, we more than won." With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt like a completely different place. The HOA board, now free from her iron grip, held an emergency vote to replace her. The new president? Mr. Dawson. His first act? Wiping away every single ridiculous fine Karen had ever issued. The Johnsons put up new decorations without fear. Mrs. Patel planted a garden she had wanted for years. Kids started playing outside freely, without worrying about someone screaming at them for existing. And Lucas? He rolled onto the sidewalk with his basketball, tossed it into the air, and laughed like he had all the time in the world. For the first time since moving here, I took a deep breath and finally felt at home.